In 1994, a farmhouse in central Texas went up in flames. By morning, a man, his wife, and their 7-year-old granddaughter were gone without a trace. No bodies, no truck, just a pile of ash and questions no one could answer. For 18 years, the file sat cold, until a junkyard worker found something buried under rusted metal and weeds. And what came next changed everything we thought we knew about that night. Before we start, hit subscribe to help uncover the stories they tried to bury, and make sure no name stays forgotten. My name's Claire Hollis. I'm 37 now, living outside of Austin, but back then, I was just 9. I spent every summer on my cousin Emma's family farm in Bastrop County. It wasn't a big operation, just a few acres of tomatoes and sorghum, a barn that leaned a little too far west, and a windmill that creaked when the wind picked up. But to us, it was magic. There was a swing tied to a pecan tree, fireflies thick in the evenings, and cornbread that always came out of the oven just as the sun dipped low behind the hill. Emma was 7, all elbows and scraped knees. We made mud pies, drew treasure maps on notebook paper, and pretended the crawl space under the parlor was our secret hideout. Her grandparents, Gerald and Ruth Holbrook, were the kind of folks who didn't say much but always made you feel safe. Gerald could fix anything with a screwdriver and a roll of electrical tape. Ruth smelled like rose lotion and wood smoke, and called everyone Sweet Pea. That summer started like the rest. The air was hot enough to hum, and the grasshoppers leapt 3 feet high. Days were slow, stretched out with chores and lemonade and the occasional trip into town for ice cream. Gerald would play old country records in the evening, and Ruth would hum along while snapping beans. It felt like nothing could touch us out there. But I remember something changed that August. Just a little. One night I was staying over like I always did, and Emma and I were supposed to be asleep. We were under the quilt in her room whispering about frogs and whether ghosts were real. Then we heard it. A man's voice, sharp, angry, cut through the night. "I told you, Gerald. This land's no good without the creek easement. Sign the damn paper." We both froze. I'd never heard anyone yell like that on the farm, let alone at Gerald. Then came Gerald's voice, steady but low. "You're trespassing. Get off my porch before I fetch my shotgun." There was a pause. Then footsteps. A screen door slammed. Emma crept to the window and pulled back the curtain just enough to peek through. I followed. Under the yard light we saw 2 figures, Gerald standing square arms crossed and a thinner man in a windbreaker pointing at him before turning back toward a muddy SUV by the barn. A few seconds later, Ruth came into the room. Her voice was gentle, but her hands were shaking when she brushed Emma's hair back. "Back to sleep, Sweet Pea." Just a grown-up disagreement. Emma asked who the man was. Ruth smiled tight. "No one we can't handle." The next morning, everything was back to normal, or at least it looked that way. Ruth was flipping cornbread at the stove. Gerald was washing tomatoes at the sink. Emma sat on the counter legs, swinging, while I tried not to think about the man from the night before. Emma asked her grandpa why he was mad yesterday. He said, "Nothing important, sweetie. Don't worry about it." But Ruth's eyes told a different story. She kept glancing out the window like she expected that SUV to come rolling back. By late afternoon, the sky had gone the color of bruises. Gerald spent the evening shoring up the barn roof with fresh plywood hammering through the thunder. When the power flickered, Ruth lit candles and sang hymns to calm Emma. She said the storm would pass by morning. We were supposed to go back home the next day, but I never saw the Holbrooks again. The next morning, my mom came to pick me up early. Gerald's truck wasn't in the driveway. Ruth didn't come to the porch to wave. Emma didn't come running out in her bare feet. I remember standing at the edge of the gravel road, hearing nothing but the wind. And for the first time, the Holbrook farm felt wrong. She wasn't at the porch. No shoes on the steps, no screen door swinging. just the breeze moving through the grass like nothing had changed. Emma was always the first to greet us when we pulled up, waving like crazy before we'd even put the car in park. But that morning, the Hallbrook place was quiet. Too quiet. My mom leaned out the window, called for Gerald. No answer. The truck was gone, which wasn't that strange on its own. It was Sunday. They might have driven into town for feed or church, but the house looked still in a way I didn't have words for yet. The curtains were drawn. The ash trees didn't rustle. There was no coffee on the breeze. My mom said we'd come back later, but we never got the chance. Because 3 hours after we left the Hallbrook farmhouse burned to the ground. By the time we heard it was already over. Volunteers were still spraying down the last embers when we got there. Half the roof had collapsed into itself, smoke curling up from the chimney like something still alive down there. The fire chief said no remains had been found, no sign of Gerald, Ruth, or Emma. The truck wasn't on the property and there were no fresh tire tracks, just some ruts headed out the north side toward County Road 17. Folks searched the fields, the brush line, even the river past the bend. I remember standing by the fence next to my uncle watching grown men in waders drag long poles through the muddy water. They found nothing. No footprints, no clothes, no broken glass. Just that smell of charred wood and wet ash that stuck in my clothes for days. State investigators came in. They combed the place from top to bottom, said a kerosene lantern had shattered near the hearth, but couldn't confirm it was the source. Too much damage. Too little left. The case was logged as an undetermined structure fire. Gerald, Ruth, and Emma were listed as missing. The sheriff posted a notice in the feed store. The church printed flyers. There was even a segment on the local news that showed the blackened piano frame visible through what used to be a wall. But after a few months, the press moved on. Search crews stopped showing up. The case got folded into a pile with the rest unsolved, inactive, waiting. The pasture went wild after that. Waist-high ryegrass and blackberry vines curling over the old mailbox. No one claimed the land, and with no official death certificates, it just sat there. Some folks said the fire had burned so hot it left nothing behind. Others whispered that Gerald had killed Ruth and Emma and driven into the river. I didn't know what to believe. All I knew was Emma was gone, and nobody could explain why. It was 18 years later when the call came. I was sitting in my apartment in Austin, half watching the evening news, picking at cold Thai food straight from the carton. There was a story about a truck found behind a salvage yard out in Bastrop County. A 1990s red Silverado with no plates unearthed during a routine cataloging of old inventory. They showed a clip of the vehicle being lifted by crane, rusted, dented, partially covered in a rotting tarp. Then the anchor said the name. Gerald Hallbrook, registered owner. My heart stopped. It didn't slow down again until I was halfway to Bastrop 2 days later, gripping the steering wheel hard enough to leave marks. The town had changed. More gas stations, fewer trees. The corner store where we used to buy gum was now a vape shop with iron bars on the window. But the sheriff's office still stood at the far end of Main Street, and the man behind the desk was someone I recognized. Sheriff Lonnie Pierce had been Deputy Pierce when I was a kid married to my aunt for a time. His hair was thinner now, his voice slower, but he still had that same weary look around the eyes. "I figured you'd come," he said when he saw me. "Is it really theirs?" I asked. He didn't hesitate. "VIN matches." Found one of Emma's earrings wedged under the seat. He took me back to a side room where they had photos laid out on the table. The truck under the tarp, the interior, the license plate barely legible. I stared at the pictures like they might shift if I blinked hard enough. But it was real. That was their truck, and someone had gone through a lot of trouble to make sure no one found it. The next morning, I drove out to the old Hallbrook place. I wasn't sure what I expected. Maybe some piece of my childhood to still be standing. But there was nothing left except for the chimney blackened and jagged like a busted tooth rising from the ground. Weeds had swallowed the driveway. Fence posts leaned away from each other like they were trying to escape. I parked at the edge and walked in gravel crunching under my boots. It smelled like dry earth and mildew now, but I could still feel the weight of what had happened here. You don't forget that kind of silence. I stepped over what was left of the threshold. The floor had collapsed in most places, but one corner, our corner, the parlor floor where Emma and I used to hide, was still mostly intact. I knelt down and felt for the seam between the boards. It was still there. I pulled until the nails gave way, and beneath it I found a bundle wrapped in scorched cloth. Inside was Junie Emma's doll. The yarn hair was half melted, one eye gone, but I knew it. Beneath her were drawings, stick figures labeled Emma and Claire crayon suns and crooked hearts, and at the bottom a melted canister of undeveloped film. Back at the sheriff's office, I handed everything over. Sheriff Pierce called in their old phototech Donnie, a quiet man with thick glasses and a steady hand. They loaded the negatives into a viewer and started clicking through. The first few frames were warm domestic. Ruth in a blue dress cooling a pie. Emma holding a jar of fireflies. Gerald out by the tractor grease on his forearms. Then things changed. A shot of the front porch. Gerald, mid-sentence, hand raised, eyes locked on someone just out of frame. The next showed him squared off with a man in shadow. You couldn't see the face, just a coat collar the angle of his shoulders. But he wasn't a neighbor stopping by for coffee. The last photo was crooked. The man's arm extended, pointing toward the house. Later that day, I visited the salvage yard myself. The owner, Dean Harrow, said the truck showed up one morning in '95. No paperwork, no plates. He assumed it was junk and left it. When I showed him the photo of the shadowy man, he shook his head. Said it could have been anyone. But he remembered something else. A towing log, maybe. Paid in cash. No questions asked. I took that thread and followed it to the Bastrop archives. Found a line item in a dusty binder, June 6, 1995. Red pickup. No VIN. Recovered from a wheat field south of County Road 17. Driver listed as L. Given. It wasn't much, but it was something. A location. A name. A window that hadn't been there before. And when I found Lenny Given's trailer out by the reservoir, the first thing he said before I even showed him the photo was, "You looking for that red truck?" I nodded. "You remember it?" "Sure do," he said. "Found it in a wheat field. Front end all crumpled, driver door hanging open. No one inside. Was there blood?" "No," he said. "Just air that smelled like oil and something missing. Before I even got it loaded, a man in a black SUV pulled up. Paid me to drop it off at Harrow's lot. Told me not to ask questions. Said to keep quiet. And mind my health." I asked if he remembered what the man looked like. Lenny just squinted and said, "Had a limp. Smelled like cologne. Called himself Rick. But I don't think that was his name. Could it have been Earl Consincade?" He gave a dry laugh. "Wouldn't surprise me." Before I left, I asked if he could show me exactly where he found the truck. He pointed east, just past the reservoir, toward a field near Old Mill Creek. "You'll know it," he said. "The fence is still busted." That afternoon, I followed his directions. Found the field. Found the split posts' wire sagging between them. The wheat was gone, but the land still held the shape of impact. 2 snapped stakes and a dent in the earth that hadn't quite healed. I stood there a long time watching the wind ripple through the grass, and for the first time in years I let myself wonder if Emma might have survived the crash, because someone had gone to great lengths to hide that truck, and maybe someone had hidden her too. I spent the next week driving back roads that barely showed up on the map, scanning school enrollment records from the late '90s and digging through shell company deeds tied to Earl Consincade. Most of the names didn't lead anywhere. Rental properties, empty lots, LLCs set up for projects that never broke ground. But one address stood out, a small diner near the edge of Bastrop just off Highway 71. Judy's Table. I remembered it from childhood barely. The teal booths, the old menu board with curling corners. It had been there forever. I stopped in one morning mostly because I needed coffee and somewhere to sit. I was planning to go through my notes again, see if I'd missed anything. But then I looked up. She was behind the register ringing up a customer with the kind of practiced ease that came from years of routine. Her name tag read Rachel. She wasn't a kid anymore, probably mid-20s, but the moment I saw her, my whole body went still. Same wide-set hazel eyes, same dimple when she frowned. Her hair was darker now, pulled back in a low ponytail. But something about her posture, the way she shifted her weight slightly to the left, reminded me of Emma. I waited until the register was clear before walking up. I kept my tone calm. "Hi. Sorry to bother you, Rachel, right?" She smiled politely. "That's me. Can I help you?" I nodded, trying not to sound like someone who hadn't slept in 2 nights. You look like someone I used to know. A long time ago." Her name was Emma. She tilted her head, the smile still there but more guarded. Before she could answer, a woman stepped out from the kitchen. She looked to be in her mid-50s, flour dust on her apron and suspicion in her eyes. "Is there a problem?" she asked. Rachel opened her mouth, but the woman cut her off gently, laying a hand on her arm. "You're mistaken. Rachel's always lived here." She turned to me with a tight smile. "This happens sometimes. People think they see someone they lost." I didn't argue. I nodded, thanked them, and walked out into the sunlight. But I couldn't shake the feeling. That wasn't just a resemblance. I knew that face. I knew that scar just below her knee, the one from the barbed wire fence near the back pasture. I'd been there when she got it. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the motel room staring at the only photo I had of us 2 little girls on a swing barefoot and grinning knees dirty from climbing trees. I slid the picture into an envelope. The next afternoon, I waited outside the diner until her shift ended. When she stepped out the back door carrying a canvas tote, I followed from a distance until she reached a small park nearby. She sat on a bench under the oaks, and I approached slowly. "I'm not here to cause trouble," I said. "I just want to show you something." I handed her the envelope. Inside was the photo. She opened it carefully and stared at it for a long time. "I don't remember this," she said, her voice softer now. "That's okay," I told her. "You were 7. I was 9. She traced her finger over the swing chain. "That doesn't look like any swing I remember." I kept my voice steady. "It was at the Hallbrook farm. Before the fire." She flinched, just a small movement, but enough to notice. I kept going. "You had a doll named Junie. You used to keep her wrapped in a blanket under your bed. Your favorite cereal was that off-brand marshmallow one, you called it Cloud Crunch. You got that scar on your knee from the fence and you told me it made you look tough. We used to sit under the porch steps and draw dragons on paper." She didn't say anything, just stared at the photo. I stood slowly. "Keep it. That's all I ask." Then I walked away. Later that night, she was in her room. The photo lay on her nightstand beneath the glow of a soft lamp. She hadn't told her adoptive mother about the conversation. The TV buzzed with low static in the living room. The house was still. She picked up the photo again, studied the way her younger self held the chain. The joy in her face. It didn't feel entirely unfamiliar. When she fell asleep, the dream came fast. She was standing barefoot on the porch, wind moving through the tall grass. From inside the house came the sounds of laughter. Ruth's quiet chuckle, Gerald's low hum. Then came the shouting, a man's voice at the door. Gerald standing between him and the hallway. Ruth rushing forward, her voice firm but scared. The image shifted. Rain. Sheets of it pounding the windshield. The truck swerved. A flash of light, metal and glass, then silence. She remembered hitting the ground. Cold air. Wet soil. Someone kneeling beside her, a man with a flannel jacket. Broad shoulders, a gentle voice. "You're safe now." A woman wrapped a blanket around her. "Where did she come from?" "Don't know," the man said. "No ID. She's hurt. We'll take her home." The woman crouched, looked her in the eye. "Can you tell us your name?" She opened her mouth, but nothing came out, not even to herself. It was blank. Her name was gone. She jolted awake, gasping. The photo had fallen to the floor. She picked it up with shaking hands, held it to her chest. The dream had been sharp. Real. The kind that doesn't slip away when the sun comes up. She stood, walked to the window, pressed her forehead to the glass. Outside the pickup sat in the driveway. The same one from her childhood, though she'd never thought to question where it came from. She picked up her phone. The clock read 2:46 a.m. She scrolled to my number and pressed call. When I answered, I could hear it in her voice. "Claire," she whispered. "I remember." I sat up in bed. "Rachel," her voice cracked. "My name. It's Emma." I remember the porch, the swing, my grandparents, the crash. I remember everything. I didn't speak for a moment, just listened. Then I asked gently, "Do you remember who it was?" There was a pause. Then, "He used to come by. My grandpa called him Earl. He shouted the night of the fire. That's the last thing I saw before we left." I pressed the phone tighter to my ear. "Earl Consincade." "Yes." Her voice was steadier now. "What do I do?" I kept it simple. "You come with me. We go to the sheriff, and we finish this." She didn't hesitate. "Okay." Outside, the wind picked up just enough to rattle the motel window. I stood, reached for my bag, and started to gather the notes we'd need. Because whatever came next, Emma was finally ready to speak. And this time, someone was going to listen. By the time I pulled up to the curb, Emma was already there, hands in the pockets of a gray hoodie, standing near the post office where the morning light hadn't fully touched the pavement yet. She looked smaller than I remembered from the diner, not physically, just held in. Her eyes met mine through the windshield, steady but guarded, and when she climbed into the passenger seat, we didn't speak right away. I just drove. It felt better to keep moving. We took the back roads west, the ones most people forget exist unless they're lost or local. The trees hadn't changed much, but everything else had more fencing, fewer fields, the kind of quiet that doesn't belong to memory. We pulled off at a little overlook that cut into the ridge just enough to see the land slope away. The grass down below had turned yellow brittle from heat. Emma rolled down her window and leaned against the frame. Her breath fogged the glass just faintly. I kept my voice low. "Tell me what you remember." She didn't answer right away. Then slowly she turned to look at me like she wasn't sure where to start. "He used to come by," she said. "Earl, that's what Grandpa called him." I remember the way his voice sounded. Rough, like he was always chewing on gravel. He didn't knock. Just walked up like he owned the place. Grandpa didn't like him. I think Grandma was afraid of him. I stayed quiet. Just listened. The wind pressed against the window in short, dry bursts. He wanted the land, she went on. Said he had plans. Grandpa always told him no. Said it was family land. That it wasn't for sale. They argued a lot. But that last time it was different. She paused and her hands shifted in her lap, fingers twisting the hem of her sleeve. That night, I woke up to yelling, louder than usual. I crept to the top of the stairs and I saw Earl on the porch. He was shouting at Grandpa, told him he was making things harder than they needed to be. Her voice didn't shake, but it thinned. Grandpa told Grandma to get me. I remember her grabbing my arm, pulling me down the hallway. The house already smelled like smoke. Not strong, not yet, but enough that you knew something was wrong. The kitchen window glowed orange. We got into the truck and just left. I was in the back seat. I looked through the rear window as the house disappeared behind the trees. She stopped there, and I waited. We hit something, she said finally. It happened fast. I remember the noise more than anything. Metal glass. The world spun sideways. The seatbelt must have snapped, or maybe it wasn't on tight. I flew. I remember wind and dirt, and then it was morning. When I opened my eyes, I was in the woods. My arm hurt. My head felt full of water. And then this man appeared out of nowhere. Big guy. Wore flannel. He crouched down and said, "You're safe now." I didn't know what that meant. Another breath. This one sharper. There was a woman, too. She had a blanket. They didn't seem scared, just focused, like they knew what to do. She looked me in the eye and asked if I knew my name. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. Not even to myself. Everything was blank. I couldn't remember who I was. The silence that followed was long. She didn't look at me when she added, "They told me my name was Rachel. Said I'd been in an accident. That my family wasn't coming back. I believed them. I was 7. I didn't have anything else to hold on to." She turned away from the window and faced forward. They weren't cruel. They fed me, kept me warm, sent me to school. But they never talked about that night. Not once. And I didn't ask because every time I tried my head hurt, like something inside me was shutting the door. I nodded. I didn't say much. I just let her sit with it. The way people need to when memories start to fall into place too quickly. Back in town, we drove straight to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Pierce was behind his desk, glasses low on his nose, a half-eaten breakfast sandwich going cold on the blotter. When he saw us walk in, he stood. "Rachel?" he asked. Emma met his eyes. "My name is Emma Hallbrook." He looked at her for a moment. No questions, no disbelief, just a quiet shift in his expression like something heavy had finally clicked into place. "All right," he said, and motioned to the chairs across from his desk. "Start from the beginning." She told him everything. The porch, the fire, the crash, the couple, the forgotten name. I filled in what I'd found. The truck, the undeveloped film, the photo of Gerald confronting a man outside the house. Lenny Given's towing log. Earl Consincade's history of buying up land no one else would sell. When she said his name, Earl, the sheriff, leaned back and rubbed the side of his jaw. "I remember him," he said. "Slick operator. Always kept his hands clean. Had lawyers for days." I pushed forward. "We have enough. The photo puts him on the property. Her testimony places him there during the confrontation. The truck was hidden. Paid off." Sheriff Pierce didn't argue. He stood and walked over to the back wall where a whiteboard still held the original timeline from the 1994 investigation. Yellowed photos, satellite maps, a single note pinned with a rusting tack. No remains. He looked at the board a long time. "It's not enough to get a warrant," he said finally. "Not with who we're dealing with. But I believe you, and I'll do what I can." Emma didn't say anything. She didn't need to. As we left the office, I could feel it already. The resistance. The kind that doesn't say no, but delays questions, quietly reroutes. I'd seen it before, and I knew what it meant. The truth was starting to move finally. But we weren't the only ones watching. The pushback came fast. Less than a week after Emma gave her statement, we started getting calls, some polite, some not. The county clerk's office flagged Sheriff Pierce's subpoena request for old land use permits, citing insufficient cause. The DA's office left us a voicemail about political sensitivity, the kind of language you use when you're afraid of who might be listening. Pierce met with us again in the back hallway, not in his office. He kept his voice low, said Earl. Consincade's lawyers were already circling, and there were whispers of defamation if we kept Emma's name tied to the case. I could see it in his face, he believed us. But belief wasn't a shield, not in this town, especially not with someone like Earl, whose name was buried in campaign donations, church renovations, and real estate contracts from one side of the county to the other. So we stopped waiting on permission. We turned the motel room into a workspace, maps on the walls, newspaper clippings taped above the headboard, my laptop open on the nightstand. Emma sat cross-legged on the bed most nights, flipping through old yearbooks, local paper archives, anything we could get our hands on from 1993 to 96. I focused on the property records. Deeds passed through shell companies, zoning requests that were fast-tracked. A suspicious number of parcels near the Hallbrook land that had changed hands quietly the year after the fire. None of it was conclusive, but it painted a pattern, one that kept pointing back to Earl. What we needed was something nobody had noticed, a detail that didn't fit. I started writing again. Not an expose, just a post. Short, careful, a kind of open letter. I shared what we'd found publicly, the truck recovered from Harrow's yard, the undeveloped photos, the reappearance of Emma. I didn't name names. I just asked for memory. If anyone remembers anything unusual from that spring, something odd, something that never sat right, please reach out. I posted it to my old blog and cross-linked it on a community message board that still had regular traffic. 2 days later, an email came in. No subject line, just a name. Frank Garrison, retired firefighter. I was on call the night of the Hallbrook fire. I saw something. We met him at a diner just outside of Smithville. He looked older than I expected, but sharp-eyed. His hands were thick and scarred, the kind of hands that had hauled hose line for decades. He didn't waste time. Slid a small yellow notebook across the table. "This is a copy," he said. Kept a personal log back then. Insurance reasons. I flipped to the tabbed page. April 14th, 1994, 1:12 a.m. House fire reported on Old Creek Road. Under that, written in pencil, black SUV parked near fence line. Engine running. No one inside. I looked up. "You didn't put this in the official report?" Frank shook his head. Wasn't relevant. Or so I thought. Could have been a neighbor. Could have been anyone. But 2 weeks later, I saw that same SUV, same plate number, parked outside a fenced lot off Highway 185. New construction site. Lot had just changed hands. He wrote the address on a napkin. That property used to belong to Gerald Hallbrook. Got sold off real quiet few months after the fire. Buyer listed as Murray Pines Holdings. I recognized the name. I'd seen it on zoning records. It was one of Earl's shell companies. Emma sat across from him, quiet, her hands folded under the table. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm. "Do you think the SUV had anything to do with what happened to my grandparents?" Frank didn't answer right away. He just said, "I think you're not crazy to be asking." The sheriff wasn't thrilled when I brought him the napkin. Said we were operating outside the channels. But he didn't throw it out either. He made a few calls. Read my follow-up post twice. By the time the third K9 handler signed on, we had a narrow search warrant for the undeveloped lot. Limited scope. Ground level only. But it was enough. We drove out there just before dawn. Emma insisted on coming. I didn't argue. It was cold enough to bite, but the sun was already rising behind the tree line, casting that low amber light that makes everything look older. The lot was overgrown. Pine needles, dead brush, a rusted fence half swallowed by vines. The paperwork had marked it as unfit for commercial development due to drainage. I didn't buy that. The first dog signaled within 30 minutes. A German shepherd named Zeke. He circled tight around a shallow rise at the edge of the slope, then barked once, then again. A second dog followed, then a third. Crews moved in. Shovels came out. The soil wasn't deep, but it was packed hard like someone had tried to make it forget. Bones don't lie. Dental records confirmed it within 48 hours. Ruth and Gerald Holbrook hadn't died in that fire. They'd been buried deliberately, methodically, just outside the boundary line of the land they refused to sell. There was more, too. A pocket watch found near the rib cage. It still had part of a fingerprint on it. It wasn't Ruth's. It wasn't Gerald's. And it matched the partial print on record from Earl Consincade collected during a civil suit years back over a different land dispute. We resubmitted the evidence this time with teeth behind it. And while the labs did their part, Emma agreed to something we hadn't yet asked for, a formal DNA test. The results came in 4 days later. Full match. Emma Holbrook formally listed as missing age 25, alive and accounted for. We watched the arrest live from the sheriff's break room, seated beside the same evidence board that had hung undisturbed for nearly 2 decades. Deputies flanked Earl as he stepped out of his black SUV. He didn't speak, didn't resist, just turned calmly as the cuffs went on and the cameras clicked. He looked directly at the nearest lens and didn't blink. Emma didn't say anything as it played. She just watched. The news spread fast. First local, then state, then national. Real estate investors pulled out. County officials started issuing refund checks on campaign donations. People who'd once fought to keep Earl's name on their mailboxes now stepped away from microphones. The system that once protected him went quiet, but none of it brought Ruth and Gerald back. None of it gave Emma those missing years. That night we returned to the motel. The maps on the walls were still there, curling at the edges. The photo of the porch confrontation still pinned above the TV. I stood in the doorway for a long moment before asking, "What now?" Emma didn't look up. She just said, "We go to the place where they waited." Then she folded the napkin with Frank's address into her coat pocket, like something not yet finished. And that was how I knew this wasn't the end, just the next layer finally surfacing. 2 months had passed since the arrest, but it still didn't feel finished. Earl Consincade was behind bars. The charges were stacked, and Emma had a name again, legally, medically, historically. But it didn't close the space that had opened up between who she was and who she'd been. I could see it in the way she moved, how she'd pause in the middle of folding a receipt, or how she'd stare out the motel window just a little too long. The case was no longer cold, but Emma's memories were only just beginning to thaw. She'd started therapy the week after the indictment. The first session was quiet. The second one was harder. By the third, she was talking about the fire, the crash, the couple who raised her. They hadn't been cruel people, just silent. She'd learned to mirror it, learned not to ask questions, not to chase the missing pieces, until someone else did. We still drove out to the Holbrook property every few days. The county had cleared the last of the debris by then. What was left of the house had been reduced to a dark perimeter of earth where the foundation once held shape. But the land hadn't forgotten. The grass had started to grow again around the edges, small shoots pushing through ash and clay. The swing was gone, but the tree it hung from still stood bark scorched, but stubbornly alive. Emma didn't speak much during those visits. She'd walk the perimeter, sometimes stop where the kitchen had been, or kneel down where we used to draw maps on notebook paper. I let her have the quiet. She needed it more than she needed answers right then. But we weren't done. There were still questions we hadn't asked out loud, like how the truck ended up in Harrow Salvage without a single registration update, or who dropped it there. Dean Harrow had said it just showed up, but vehicles don't bury themselves. We started with towing records. The old ones, the kind still handwritten in triplicate before everything went digital. Emma helped me scan through each page date by date. Most of it was routine broken axles, stalled engines, junk jobs paid in cash. but on the fifth ledger buried between two entries about tire blowouts on the 95 bypass we found it. June 6, 1995. Red pickup. No VIN. Wheatfield recovery. Paid cash. Towed by L. Given. I copied the entry down, then drove out to a mobile home park near the reservoir, where the name had once come up, Lenny Given. He answered the door, wearing a racing cap and an old windbreaker, eyes squinting under the brim like he'd never quite adjusted to sunlight. He didn't look surprised when I said the Hallbrook name. "You a reporter?" he asked. "No," I said. "I was Emma's best friend." He let that sit a second, then motioned to a cracked lawn chair on the porch. "I remember the truck," he said. "Found it half buried in a wheat field halfway out to the county line. The front end was a mess, looked like it hit something hard, maybe a fence post. Driver's door was hanging open, windshield cracked. But no blood, no plates, no people. I asked if anyone had followed up. Before I even had it winched up, he said, 'This guy pulls in behind me.' Black SUV. Big guy, mid-40s, heavy cologne, wore sunglasses even though it was cloudy. Said his name was Rick, but he didn't look me in the eye. Told me the truck wasn't stolen, just needed gone. Offered to pay triple my usual rate. Said to take it to Harrow's yard. Told me to forget it." Emma sat still beside me. Her hands were clasped tight around a paper cup, knuckles white. I asked the next question gently. "Did he threaten you?" Lenny's mouth pulled tight. "Not directly, just said I should mind my health. My wife was sick that year. I needed the money. I kept quiet. Could it have been Earl Consincade?" Lenny didn't answer right away. Then he gave a short laugh, dry and empty. "Wouldn't surprise me. That man's fingerprints are all over this county, even where you can't see them." Before we left, I asked him to show us exactly where he'd found the truck. He pointed down past the reservoir toward an old field behind the Cooper place. "Take the dirt road behind the water tower. You'll see two fence posts snapped in half. They're still there last I checked." We went straight there. The road was rough, overgrown in places, but passable. Just like he said, two weathered posts wire curled low where something heavy had torn through years ago. The wheat was gone now, replaced with tall grass and scattered cedar. But the shape of the land hadn't changed. You could still see the dip in the field where the truck might have slowed and come to rest. Emma stepped out first, walked slowly, scanning the soil. I followed behind her, not saying anything. The breeze kicked up just enough to rattle the grass. No tire marks, not after all that time, but there was something about the way the space felt like a pause held too long. Lenny had said the wheat around the crash looked flattened, like someone or something had gone through it. And if Emma had been thrown, if she'd landed somewhere nearby, it meant she might have wandered from this spot, dazed, alone. She stopped near the break in the fence and knelt down, fingers brushing the dried grass. "I remember the field," she said. "I don't remember getting here. But this is where it ended." The sun dipped low behind the tree line, casting long shadows across the ridge. She stood brushing dirt from her knees and looked toward the place the truck would have come from. "They never meant for us to be found," she said, and I knew she wasn't just talking about the truck or the fire. She meant everything that came after. That night back at the motel, Emma sat on the floor while I pieced together our map again, connecting the red string from where the crash occurred to the salvage yard to the SUV spotted the night of the fire to the company names tucked into shell after shell. She watched quietly for a while, then said, "You know, he wasn't the only one involved, right?" I looked over. She kept her eyes on the thread. "He had help. No one hides a truck, buries bodies, and disappears a child without help." Her voice was steady, not angry, just certain. She wasn't just recovering memory anymore. She was building something out of it. A shape, a trail. And wherever it led next, we both knew it was still out there. Waiting. We didn't plan to go back to the house. Emma just said it one afternoon like she was remembering something already in motion. "There's one room I haven't told you about," she said. We'd been going through boxes again, rechecking notes, and she just looked up from an old survey map and said it as flatly as if she'd asked for a glass of water. I waited, gave her space, but I knew from her face this wasn't just a hunch, it was something she'd been holding back. She walked over to the motel desk, pulled a folded paper from the back of her journal. It was a sketch, rough but clear, a layout of the old Hallbrook house. "My bedroom was on the second floor," she said, pointing. "But before the fire, my grandfather built a crawl space off the root cellar. Said it was for tools, but I remember going in there once with him when I was little. There was a trap door under the back shelving unit. He told me not to talk about it." She didn't say more than that. Didn't have to. By the time we pulled onto Old Creek Road that night, the wind had shifted again, and you could smell the coming rain. The structure was long gone, but the basement still remained partially filled in by the fire crews years ago, blocked off with a rotting length of plywood and a no trespassing sign someone had tacked up years too late. We stepped through what was left of the back threshold and worked our way down with flashlights, careful not to kick loose the stone footing. The air inside was damp and cold even in the middle of July. That smell earth-old ash rust wrapped around us like something still waiting to settle. Emma moved with quiet certainty, stepping around debris like muscle memory was guiding her. She stopped at the back wall and crouched down, brushing away years of dust and soot. I held the light steady. That shelving unit had once held paint cans and canning jars, most of them shattered now, but the frame was still bolted into the foundation. She ran her fingers along the base, searching, then paused. "Here," she said. I bent down beside her. A faint metal outline cut into the concrete, barely visible but definitely there. We worked together to pry the cover loose. It wasn't elegant. Took nearly half an hour, a crowbar and a flathead screwdriver we'd brought for car work. But finally it gave with a groan. A shallow draft of air rose up like something had exhaled. The opening wasn't wide, just big enough to crawl through, maybe 3 feet across, less than 2 feet high. I slid in first flashlight, clenched in one hand, the beam cutting across packed earth and low beams. The tunnel sloped gently downward. At the end was a room, maybe 6 feet by 6, cut directly into the earth. The walls had been lined with plastic, at some point frayed, now yellowed, and in the corner sat a milk crate sealed with black tape. I waited for Emma to catch up. She crouched beside me, reached forward, and peeled the tape back with slow, steady hands. Inside were 3 items: a Polaroid photo, a small cassette tape in a plastic sleeve, and a manila folder marked in her grandfather's handwriting just in case. She held the photo up to the flashlight. It showed her at around 3 years old, sitting on the front porch with her grandmother, both of them waving at the camera. But in the background, half caught in the screen door's reflection, was the face of a man neither of us recognized. "That's not Earl," she whispered. We unspooled the tape next. It had warped slightly from age, but the audio was intact. Her grandfather's voice, shaky, deliberate, filled the space around us like he was still sitting in that room. "If you're hearing this," it began, "then you know the land was never the problem. It was what they wanted to build. Earl wasn't alone. He just knew how to take the heat." Then a pause. A breath. I saw the plans. Military-grade fencing. Underground access. No public records. They wanted the back acreage for something else. Something federal. I told them no. Then we got the letter. There was a shuffling sound, maybe of paper. Then Ruth's voice in the background. "Tell them what you saw." Gerald continued. 2 nights before the fire, I saw a man watching the house from the woods. Same one from the meeting, not local. Didn't blink when I walked toward him. Just turned and walked back into the trees. I don't know what he was, but I know who he worked for. The tape cut off there. Emma just sat with it for a moment, eyes fixed on the player, breathing slow and shallow. Then she opened the folder. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed, dated 3 months before the fire. A zoning proposal stamped with the seal of a company I'd never heard of. Orchid Pine Developments, but the corporate address linked back to D.C., and the project name was circled in ink Silent Ridge. We didn't speak for a long time, just sat there in that dirt-walled room holding pieces of a story no one had wanted told. I looked over at Emma. Her shoulders were tense, but her expression had changed. It wasn't fear I saw there. It was resolve. "They tried to bury this," she said quietly, "but they forgot who built the house. When we climbed back up into the night air, the rain had started. Light, but steady, washing over the ruins. We didn't cover the trap door. Not this time. We left it open, exposed like a wound finally allowed to breathe." Emma didn't look back. She just said, "We need to find out who else was in that meeting." And we walked to the car like we'd crossed into something new, something deeper than personal loss, something that was never meant to be seen. The first name we traced from that zoning document was a man named Clarence Dupree. He wasn't local. Lived 3 counties over, retired Army engineer with a quiet record and a history of land acquisition deals that never made it to the public ledger. I pulled his last known address from a tax database small place out near a defunct railroad stop. Emma and I drove out there the following morning just after sunrise. The house was plain, pale yellow siding with a rusted tin roof. There was a flag out front, faded to pink and gray, and an old Buick under a tarp that hadn't moved in years. He answered the door with a cane in one hand and a look in his eyes that told me he already knew why we were there. "You're from the Hallbrook case," he said. It wasn't a question. I introduced us anyway. Emma didn't speak at first, just stood behind me, quiet, unreadable. Dupree gestured for us to come inside. The place smelled like engine oil and mothballs. He pointed us toward the couch, then lowered himself into a recliner and stared at the floor for a few seconds before he spoke. "I never signed off on it," he said. "They asked me to. God knows they did. But I didn't put ink to anything. I asked who they were." He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "You already know Earl wasn't the one in charge. He was the go-between, the cleanup man, the one who handled things when other people didn't want their fingerprints on it." Emma finally spoke. "Then who was?" Dupree leaned back, eyes still down. "Project manager was a woman named Angela Cortland. Came out of nowhere. Black SUV briefcase full of documents. Everything. Hush, hush. They pitched it like a public-private thing, development for a, quote, testing facility. But it wasn't for any civilian use. Said the Hallbrook land was ideal. No major road traffic, no power lines cutting across it. No neighbors who asked too many questions. He said Gerald Hallbrook had refused to sell outright and early. And that 3 weeks later someone tried to bribe him again, this time through a legal proxy. Still no sale. And then came the fire. "I don't think they planned it like that," Dupree said. "I think they wanted a slow squeeze zoning pressure easements permits. But something changed. Something spooked them." I asked what. He didn't know, but he said he'd seen a letter. Said it mentioned non-compliance risk and containment. That word stuck with me. Containment. Like they weren't just trying to build something, they were trying to keep something else out. Or in. We left not long after. Emma shook his hand before we did. No anger in her face. Just that same quiet certainty she'd carried since the trapdoor. That night I called in a favor from an old contact, someone I'd met back when I still worked intake for a cold case unit. He owed me a few. I asked him to run a background check on Angela Cortland. 10 minutes later, he called back. "You're not going to find her in any federal registry," he said. "But her name pops up in a sealed environmental impact review out of Quantico from 1991. Project coded as Echo 14. The same year the Hallbrooks had started fighting the county over zoning. He sent over a redacted PDF that showed almost nothing, but one line stood out near the bottom. Subject location includes previously surveyed geological anomaly access restricted per federal order. I showed it to Emma. Her hands were steady, but her voice had tightened. They weren't trying to buy the house, she said. They wanted what was under it. The next morning, we were back at the Hallbrook property, this time with ground-penetrating radar borrowed from a university program we'd paid out of pocket for. The guy who brought it thought we were just doing a soil study. Took 2 hours to scan the full plot. But near the northwest edge of the land, just beyond where the root cellar had once ended, he flagged an unusual void about 6 feet down, roughly the size of a storage chamber. No pipes nearby, no septic records. No reason it should have been there. Emma crouched down beside the marker flag and pressed her palm to the soil. "He built it," she said. "He built something he didn't tell anyone about." That night I filed a report with the state investigator's office, attached the radar scans, the zoning papers, the audio tape. Didn't expect much, but 2 days later they called us in. Not just a detective. A federal rep sat in on the meeting. Black blazer, clean nails, no badge in sight. She asked Emma to recount everything from memory. Emma did slowly, deliberately, every detail. When she finished, the rep thanked her, said they'd follow up internally, and that was it. No contact after that. No confirmation. Just silence. Until the news broke 5 days later. Earl Consincade had been found in his cell, dead. Official word said natural causes, but the autopsy was sealed. No public record. No family listed. No funeral. His entire file was scrubbed within a week. Emma didn't cry. She didn't say anything for a long while, just sat in the car beside me on the edge of Route 9 watching the sun go down behind the tree line. Then she said, "It wasn't justice, but it was an ending." I didn't argue. Some things aren't meant to be fixed, just faced. We drove home that night without music. No words, just the sound of tires on asphalt, long stretches of open land, and the quiet understanding that we had finally stepped out of the tunnel. But not into the light, just into something quieter, less hidden. What came next would belong to someone else, someone ready to carry it further, because the truth hadn't disappeared. It was just waiting for the right person to keep pulling the thread. I haven't set foot near the Hallbrook property in over a year now. The county posted a fence around it after the federal team finished their sweep. They claimed it was to stabilize the ground, but no one in town believes that's the full reason. The land's still quiet, overgrown now. No construction crews, no new development, just wind and time and whatever still rests underneath. Emma moved back to Asheville last fall. She and her mother stay close, but there's a weight to her now I don't think she'll ever put down completely. And maybe that's all right. She doesn't talk about her father much anymore, not the man he became, but sometimes when we're both still and the day's starting to close in around us, she'll mention the smell of sawdust or the way his laugh used to echo through the kitchen. It's those things she's holding on to now, not the cellar, not the whispers, just the parts that stayed soft. As for me, I stepped back from everything once the investigation went dark. They sealed the case quietly. No charges filed, no final statement released. Earl Consincade was buried in an unmarked grave outside state lines. The others, if there were others, were never named. I filed everything I had. Scans, notes, interviews, even the original floor plan Emma sketched from memory. I sent copies to every state agency that would take them. Most never responded. A few sent back form letters, but I kept the originals. They're locked away safe, labeled with a date and a single-word echo. Sometimes people ask me why we didn't push harder, why we didn't take it to the press or keep fighting or drag it into the light ourselves, and maybe we could have. But I've learned something about truth. Sometimes it's not about exposing every inch of it. Sometimes it's about bearing witness, saying I saw this, I heard it, I believe it happened. And I remember. That's what Emma needed most. Not justice in the courtroom sense, just acknowledgement. And I think in the end that's what she gave her father too. If you asked me what I think really happened under that house, I'd tell you this. I don't know everything, but I know enough to say that something went wrong, something old, buried, and quietly dangerous. And for reasons we may never fully understand, someone decided it was better left sealed. Maybe they were right. Or maybe they just didn't want to answer for it. Either way, it's part of our history now, not printed in a book or carved on a stone, but carried in memory, in voices like Emma's, in quiet, steady retellings that refuse to let it vanish. Thank you for staying with us through this story. If it meant something to you, if it stayed with you after the last word, consider sharing it. So, no name, no place, and no silence gets forgotten.